So we got our scrollable list here, and this is implemented with this scroll view. Now this solution has one downside, one disadvantage though. Scroll view is great if you want to add scrolling around some content. For example, if you had an article which would be too long to fit on a screen, or you simply don't know which device sizes your users will be using and you want to make sure that an article, for example, is scrollable, in such situations, scroll view is perfect. For lists as we have it here, it's not perfect though. The reason for that is that lists like this could become very long. Sure, you might only have like 10 or 20 items on there, and especially for such a goal list, it's very likely that you have around that size or around that amount of items. But you could also have lists with hundreds or thousands of items. Now, what scroll view does is it always renders all the items that are inside of it whenever the overall UI is rendered. So even if an item is not currently on the screen, like this last list item here, this item is still rendered behind the scenes even though it's not visible yet. Because scroll view renders all its child items, no matter if we're talking about 10, 20, or 10,000 items. And for very long lists, this can become a performance issue. If you have a long list with dozens or hundreds or thousands of items, rendering them all at the beginning, even though the vast majority is not even visible to the user, will slow down the app. And of course, that's not something we want. Therefore, scroll view is great for limited amounts of content, like an article which has a fixed end at some point. But for dynamic lists, which could become super long, we typically don't want to use scroll view. We can, but we typically don't want to avoid possible performance issues. A better solution for such scenarios is another built-in component that ships with React Native, the FlatList component. This is another component that will help with scrolling, but as the name suggests, it's specifically built for scrollable lists, and internally it will only render the items that are actually visible. And all the items that are off screen will only be loaded and rendered lazily as they are needed because the user is scrolling. Now, internally, FlatList will have a small threshold to make sure it already starts loading and rendering items before they are visible, but it will only render them as the user gets closer to them as he or she is scrolling the list. If you have 1,000 items in your list, the vast majority of items will not be loaded and will not be rendered when using FlatList. So how do we use FlatList then? Well, you do use it by replacing scroll view with it. So we replace scroll view with FlatList. Now regarding this always bounce vertical prop here, this is still supported. So you can leave it there because FlatList actually supports pretty much all of the props scroll view supports. Because internally it kind of has a similar implementation, but with this optimization of only loading data when it's needed. So this is a first step, but we're not finished yet. We replace scroll view with FlatList. The next step is that we get rid of our custom mapping code here. We remove that. We no longer map our data manually. Instead, we now have to pass this task to FlatList so that it can render this list efficiently by only rendering what's needed. FlatList is now in charge of this, hence we need to let FlatList do that. And this is done by giving FlatList two important props. The first one is the data prop, which is a required prop. This is a prop that points at the data that should be output in this list. In our example here, that would be the course goals array. That's the data that should be output as a list, so we pass this as a value to data. But that doesn't tell FlatList how the data should be rendered. You don't tell FlatList by passing content like this between the opening and closing tags. That's not how we use FlatList. Instead, we should cut this, and we can turn FlatList into a self-closing component. And we add another key prop now. And that's another required prop, the render item prop. This is a prop that wants a function as a value, a function that will tell FlatList how to render the individual data items. Therefore, it is a function that will receive the individual item as a parameter automatically. FlatList will pass in this item whenever it calls this function, and it will call this function whenever it determines that a new item must be rendered because the user is scrolling and a new item should be made visible. And therefore, in this function, in this arrow function which I defined here, you then return the JSX code that should be rendered for a given item. Now, of course, we want to output our item data, and we receive this item parameter value automatically by FlatList. But this item which we get here is actually an object generated by FlatList internally. An object that is wrapped around the individual data items we have in our data array. And therefore, I will actually name this item data because it's actually an object that does not just contain our values, but also some metadata. Now, item data does, for example, also give us access to an index property. Again, this object with this property is generated by FlatList, and this holds the index of the different items that are rendered. First item here has an index of 0, the second item has an index of 1, and so on. But item data also holds another property that's very important for us. And that's the property I will output here, the item property. This will hold the actual data items, one for each list item that's being rendered. So with item data.item, we get access to the different data items we have here. Now with that, we can get rid of this key prop because we're no longer mapping this list manually, and hence keys are no longer managed like this. We will come back to keys in a second, but for the moment we'll remove it. And now I will reload the apps by pressing R here in the terminal with the terminal selected. And if I now add another new item here, you will see it shows up, and I can add multiple items here. And if I add enough items to exceed this screen height, so if I add more and more items here, you will see that this list also is scrollable. I can scroll here. But you also see, of course, that I'm getting a warning. I did get it right from the start, actually. And the warning is in the end that I'm missing some keys here. Because it's still a list, and therefore we still should add keys, but we don't add them as we added them before. Instead, when using FlatList, there are two main ways of adding keys to these list items. The first approach is to turn your data values from primitive values like strings, as we have it here, into objects that have a key property. And that's what I'll do here. When I add a new course goal, instead of just adding the entered text like this as a goal, so as a plain string, I will wrap this into an object where I, for example, have a text property that holds the actual goal text, but where I actually also add a key property, which I set to a unique key. Now, to generate a unique key here, I will actually use math random to string like this, which is not really a unique key. I could generate the same number twice, but it's good enough for this demo here. And now with that, every item in my course goals array is actually an object with a text property and with a key property. And the special thing is that FlatList will automatically look for such a key property. So FlatList does work with primitive values in the data array as well, as you saw a couple of minutes ago. But it works even better if your data in this data array is a list of objects. So if you have a list of objects as data, and every object has a key property, because then this key property will automatically be used as a key for the items that are rendered. Now that we turned our items into objects here, though, we have to make sure that when we access the data that belongs to a single item, we dive into the text property here on the item. Because every item is now an object with a text property. That's what we set up here. Hence, we have to access this text property down here. And with that, if we save this and again reload this, and I now start adding items here, you will see that now I can add items as many as I want, and I don't get this warning anymore, and I got this scrollable list. And under the hood, only the items that are needed are being rendered, and the other items will be loaded lazily as we scroll closer to them. That's how this FlatList works now. Now, if you don't have a property named key, because you're maybe getting data from an API and you can't influence its shape, and you don't want to transform it just because FlatList needs that key property, you also got an alternative to setting up such a key property in the input data. Let's say this would be named ID. This would be a reasonable property name, because this could be a unique ID, but it would be the wrong name because this list is not looking for an ID property, but for a key property. Now, of course, we could transform it, but if you don't want to do that, you can go to your FlatList and you can add another prop to the FlatList component. And that would be the key extractor prop. The key extractor prop wants a function as a value, for example, an inline arrow function, but you could also define a function somewhere else and pass a pointer at it here. And this is a function which will automatically receive two parameter values, item and index. These two values will be provided by FlatList when it calls this function for you, and it will call this function for you for every list item that's being rendered. Now, the render item function is also called for every list item that's rendered, but the render item function is responsible for generating the JSX code that should be rendered for every item. Key extractor, on the other hand, this function is simply called to get a key out of every item, which then under the hood will be attached to the item by the FlatList. And therefore here you should return the key. And since you get the item as the first parameter value, and since I know that every item for me is an object with an ID property, and since I know that the ID property makes for a great key, since it will be unique, I can return item.id here. And with that, I simply tell FlatList how it gets to a unique key for every item it outputs. So with that, if I save this and I then again reload everything here, if I again learn React Native here, this works as before, and I don't get any warnings. This, of course, also works here on Android, if you want to see it there. I can add multiple goals there as well, and there it's also scrollable. So that's FlatList in action, and you should use FlatList whenever you have lists with dynamic data that should be scrollable, and especially if you have lists that could be super long, then for performance reasons, FlatList is better than ScrollView.